Well, this is really my world. This graph, which is you can download, it's on the web, sort of represents, in a way, my journey in research. I started doing multimedia, hypermedia, before they were called that, in the 80s, before the web existed. And I first met Tim at a conference in 1990, just as he was putting the first website up, so there was one website. Can you remember those days? In 1994, before this, so the red line is the number of estimated users of the internet, and they're usually using through a web application. The blue line is the number of internet hosts. In 1994, before this rather high-level shot of the web starts to take off, there was a document written when Tim had to move from Europe to America because the European Commission would not adopt the web, and he couldn't get funding in Europe. Does this sound familiar? But they were prepared to fund him in the States, and there was an agreement between the European Commission. George Metakides, you may or may not have heard of him, he started the Esprit projects. He found $1 million, whatever currency they traded it in those days, and Michael de Toussos at MIT found $1 million, and together that $2 million created a chair for Tim at MIT, where he went on to build the World Wide Web Consortium, which he runs to this day from MIT. And the document making the case for this money said, this is 1994, there's something like, I can't remember, I should have looked it up, 700 and something websites. Isn't that amazing? And in 1994 it was. To us in the community, this was an amazing number, that 700 people had bothered to put a website up and were beginning to use it. How the world has changed in those 21 years, to a world where we are now totally dependent on this infrastructure. This is quite phenomenal in the sense that our civilization has never experienced growth so fast, something we're now so dependent on, and we really know nothing about. Right? We don't really know how it works. Nobody owns it. There's no shareholders. Nobody's making any money out of it. That was the whole point of the way Tim set it up. Who's going to manage it in the future? These are all open questions. So my world, in a nutshell, is trying to get some of these answers. And why I could talk to this slide for the rest of the 40 minutes. I won't. There's all sorts of interesting stories captured just on this one perspective, which is really the technological perspective of this growth pattern. Seeing where some of the companies emerged. See, Google was 10 years after the first website went up. We didn't get Wi-Fi and broadband till 12 years after. So that dot-com bubble was bound to burst because we just didn't have the technology in our homes to do shopping at home. Remember the World Wide Wait, where you had to dial up and get those blurping sounds, and then you'd download an image and it would just crash? There was a technology bubble there. People piled in because they all thought they were going to be Bill Gates. But Tim wasn't a Bill Gates. Tim gave it away, which was his legacy to the world, really. And the essay we often set our students, well, I like to think we set our students. I don't teach them that much, so we probably don't. But anyway, the essay we could set our students is, well, what would have been different if Tim had sold the web to somebody? If CERN had said, we are going to commercialize this? There was experience at the time. I said I wouldn't tell these stories, but I can't help it. I get into them. Do you remember Gopher? Any of you remember Gopher, Lycos? They were around before the web. These were ways of getting on, downloading documents from the internet using a bit of hypermedia. And Gopher from University of Minnesota was beginning to get traction. And then Minnesota said, well, we're going to start charging for this. So everyone goes, ooh, why are we going to pay? And Tim's thesis was, I have to give it away. Either everyone will use it or nobody will. This thing is either for everybody, as he said at the Olympic Games, or it will be fractured and siloed and it will not achieve its full potential. Because the internet and the web And this is the answer to your final exam question at the end of my talk. The internet and the web work on the network effect. And they work, they operate, they succeed. Things on the web succeed when it goes viral and people pile in. Everybody's using it. The other thing about the way Tim set it up with the open protocols and the fact that he gave it away was it determined the business model for a long time. It's beginning to change a bit now, but basically, in the early days and really right up until now, if you want to launch something on the web, you have to give it away for free and work out how you make your money afterwards. And companies like Google have done that very well. Facebook's and Twitter's, not so well, because really their capital is us, how many people they have using them. And if we stop using them, their capital will disappear. Google are diversifying very cleverly and are selling us cars and all sorts of things. So as a company, are very likely to survive much longer. But this was all part of the way that Tim designed the thing in the first place. And not a lot of people realise this, in the words of Michael Caine. Not a lot of people know that. Because people were searching around for, well, how do I make money of this? Anyway, why am I saying all this to you today? Well, the point is that any time anybody does anything in this space, every time you interact with the internet through a web service, a web application, you leave a point of data. It's digital footprints, and all our digital footprints are all over the place. And there are trillions and trillions and trillions of these in every part of the world, almost getting there. Not everywhere. There's still billions of people to get onto this thing, but the internet is getting to most countries now, and certainly in the Western world and in the Far East, the numbers of people are into the trillions and trillions. So we have huge amounts of data. And I talk about this being big data on steroids, because it's about what people do. Right? It's not about what machines do. It's not about what the climate's doing. It's not about what's happening in the stars. So it's not nice round or unround numbers in homogeneous data sets that you can collect on one big server and apply some fast algorithms to. It's about people. So there's all the issues of privacy and trust and security and ethics of how you do the experiments. And those issues are huge in the world that I work in, because before we can do any analysis of the data, we've got to worry about those issues. So that's where I want to come to with this talk, basically. So let me take you to that point. I have to stop talking now, but we'll never get to other slides. So one other point to make, that Tim is well known, of course, for being the inventor of the web, and people think of the web as a web of documents, and it has led to, if I just go back, it's led to the social network. So he will say nowadays, I thought I designed something to link documents. Actually, I now know it was designed to link people. And that's really, if he wins the Nobel Prize, it will be for peace, maybe, rather than there's no scientific Nobel Prize he can win. But it's that sort of, it's much harder to be unfriendly with, or to be enemies with people who you actually see in this amazing global space. So that's debatable as well, as to how much it's led to peace and how much it's led to whatever the chaos or really nasty situations. But because there's a yin and a yang to everything, but it's certainly given us a global information system. But as a part of his original vision also included the web of linked data, which he rather erroneously called the semantic web, or rather not incorrectly either. It was probably the wrong thing to call it, because he writes about this in his book, Weaving the Web, because he thought about the web as because machines, as you've been hearing today, are really good at analysing data. If you describe data to a computer or a distributed network of computers, the machines can crunch that data, link it, and produce answers that we can't even begin to do as individuals. Whereas we, as individuals, can look at a document on a machine and know exactly what it's about straight away. So you show me a text document, I can look, even if I don't understand, I can look and tell you what it's about. Same with, even more so with pictures and videos and audios. We're still a long, long way off machines being at the same level as we are in that respect. And some of that panel discussion was about that. How much does Watson understand the answers it's producing? But it can produce answers by doing very clever analysis of data. And actually Watson used a huge amount of semantic linking. But the problem for Tim was he called it the Semantic Web, which sent him off to the AI enthusiasts, the artificial intelligence enthusiasts. And I always say there's about 2000, 2001, the Semantic Web went down an AI rat hole where it got very over-analysed by very eager artificial intelligence researchers. And it took a while to emerge back up. And around 2006, we being my colleague Nigel Shadbolt, Tim and I started talking about, well, why doesn't the world get the fact that this whole ecosystem will be much richer if we give the machines data to analyse? So we describe our documents using better data, and we get the data out of the structured databases and link it all together using the machines, and we'll get knowledge we had never dreamed of. And we boiled it down to some very simple principles of you can use the same, you just need to get the data out there basically, and then you can use the same protocols that you use for putting the documents out, using some standard like the Resource Description Framework, RDF, that W3C set up, or you can use XML if you insist, or other languages, but basically something that machine can read, and then link those data sets together using common terms. You have it done. Keep your ontologies really, really, really simple. And I'm not saying we turned the tide, but it was part of the turning of the tide where people started to realise, actually, we can start simple and then let the complicated stuff take care of itself, rather than trying to boil the ocean and write one big global ontology to start with. And the tide started to turn, but as we were doing this work, we look back at that graph I showed you, or as it was in 2004 when we started doing this, to try and think about how the web had evolved to where it was then. So we started, the three of us are computer scientists effectively, with different backgrounds, but basically computer scientists, and we started talking to lawyers and social scientists and economists and political scientists about why this had all happened. And we realised that actually we were taking the wrong tack in trying to understand this ecosystem from a technical point of view. And we had to think of it from a very interdisciplinary point of view. And here we are today. The linked data is beginning to emerge, and many companies use it now, including Google, having ignored it for so long, and Microsoft and IBM. They now use semantic web technology. Google call it knowledge graph, but it's still semantic, it's linked data. And part of this, Tim and Nigel led on the open data work in the UK, which has now gone worldwide, which is all part of Tim's idea of let's get the data out there. Give me your data like you gave me your documents. And it's estimated that maybe less than 20% of the data that's produced can be open, because most of the data we produce is going to be private, either commercially or secure because of security reasons or because of ethical reasons. But start with the easy stuff, the open data, and then we'll get into that meme of linking data. And now that has sort of been overtaken by the big data meme, but I just wanted to make the point that there's a huge amount of big data needed to be analysed to understand this ecosystem that is generating the big data. So there's an interesting loop here. As we went through this thought process, we decided, for good or bad reasons, to dream up a new research discipline, which we called web science. And I always say there's two things I hate about web science as the name. One is web and the other is science, because it sort of implies to people it's only about the web, which they think of as a very small thing, science means it's very technical, where we meant the broadest sense of science and the broadest sense of the web being the web of people. as much as the web of documents or data. So anyway, and we thought of it as this ecosystem that we have created. And this was the other thing that was the great sort of light that we had, was that by talking to the social scientists, I learnt the word co-constituted. That in fact, this ecosystem doesn't grow because as an engineering product. It grows. The way Tim designed it enables it to grow, but it grows. It grows because we put content onto it. It wouldn't grow if we didn't want to share information, and if we didn't all want to be part of the Facebooks and the Twitters, and if we didn't all put in entries into Wikipedia, and if we didn't all put our pictures on Flickr and our videos on YouTube, there would be nothing there. And in fact, of course, Google, we feed the beast all the time, because every time you put a search term into Google, you click on a link, you are refining the Google algorithm. So they make money out of us every which way, because we are part of the solution as well as the people they're selling to. So we are part of this system. There's no getting away from it. And people say to me, oh, what about the pornography? What about the terrorism? Well, it's because these are the problems society has, and the bullying, and this is what happens in the real world, and it's amplified in this ecosystem that we have created. It's not Tim Berners-Lee's fault. That's what society's like, and we then have to retrospectively work out how to manage the bad stuff. That's what society's about. Only this is happening in 20 years, whereas working out the bad stuff about the fact that, generally speaking, I'm not going to go out of this door and get killed so that someone takes my money. Generally speaking, I could be unlucky today, but because society's taught us, we learn to live as good citizens, generally. But in this digital space, we've only had 20-odd years, just 20 years, really. And so the bad stuff happens before we've learned how to deal with it. Also, the other thing to recognise is that, as I said about the way Tim designed the open and free protocols, everything has to start free, so it has to start in the micro. If you remember when Google started, there was nothing on there. When Wikipedia started, there was nothing on there. And it isn't until, this is the network effect again, it's not until everybody starts using it, you've got enough, it's that Google's harvesting enough documents, and it's got enough of us using it to get the recommender system working. Or with Wikipedia, there's enough content for it to people to add more content because they see that it's useful and that they can correct content that's ever read. These systems have to grow, and they go from the micro, i.e. nobody using them, and it feels like suddenly everybody's using them. How does it go from that micro to that macro? That's sort of the great question of web science, really. And that's what we thought the question we were asking when we set out on this journey. How did we, the question was, well, how are we going to get people using the semantic web? That's how we started doing all this. Anyway, so we're now thinking of it as a socio-technical system that we have to think of from a very interdisciplinary point of view. And here's some of the subjects that impinge on the web science. You know, we need to understand, I've learned quite a lot of sociology while doing this. There's psychology in it, there's AI, obviously, computer science, engineering, there's a lot of mathematics in the network science underneath it, huge amounts of political science and law and economics. Because, you know, the rules, the regulations, the policies that the government set, the way the big companies set themselves up, that constrains this ecosystem. And we need to understand what happens when these ecosystems get constrained. And the first country to take itself off the internet was Egypt. And it quickly went back on because it realised it was going to lose all its business. But since then, we've had lots of countries experimenting with this, and countries that, since Snowden, when we had, the Germans saying, well, we want to create our own internet because the Americans are spying on us, and then we find well, of course, the Germans are spying on everybody too, and of course it all happens at GCHQ, and then there's China and Russia, and what's India doing in all this? And suddenly you're into this space where nobody knows, well, everybody knows they're being spied on, but by whom, and what are they doing with that data, and Anyway, how did I get onto that? Oh, yes, because you get knee-jerk reactions from politicians who will then pass laws because they think they're solving a problem and they're just creating lots of other ones. And it's happening so fast that we, again, don't have time to really think it through. So yeah, that's some of the disciplines that we not have to work with. It's not we're being forced to. I'm enjoying working with in order to understand this ecosystem. So we set up a Web Science Trust. It doesn't. The only thing that you really need to know about this is that as we were setting this thing up and thinking, because the key thing was that web science, this sort of work has to happen, like medical science, like climate science, has to happen all around the world. You can't. There's no one country that has a monopoly on medical science or climate science or physics or web science. These are all things that have to happen in a global collaborative research space, or you can't know what the answers. You can't find out the answers. So the key thing that we've done is set up a network of laboratories, of well-known universities who sign up to the Web Science Agenda and using them as flagships around the world, and bringing in the new ones, setting up in India. We just got one joined from Adelaide. I mean, this is an open network, but the filter is, have you got enough people to make a real difference in the space, in the region, and to be able to track data, and I'll come back to that in a minute. So I'm very keen to I haven't got all these set up, or we haven't got all these set up, but I'm very keen to bring on laboratories in countries all around the world. So one other point before I get to the data analytics is, another way of thinking about this comes from Tim, is the idea of a web as a social machine. This is a quote from his book, Weaving the Web, and I've sort of alluded to it already. This is us thinking of web science, recasting it, so this was about 5 years ago, as the theory and practice of social machines. And Tim talks about social machines in his book. He says, real life must be full of all kinds of social constraints, the very processes from which society arises. This is what I was talking about earlier. Over hundreds of years, thousands of years, we've learnt to live as generally, I mean, there's pockets of the world that seem to be going backwards in time, but generally we've learnt to live as civilized beings in local, national, and international societies. And things about not killing people and, not stealing from people and behaving nicely in the street and all that sort of stuff comes from being part of this type of, we put constraints on people so that we can live as civilized societies. And what Tim's saying here is that we have to do the same in the digital world, and we have to use the machines to help us. So he's saying computers help if we can use them to create abstract social machines on the web, processes in which people do the creativity and the machine does the administration. And if you take that description of a social machine, then almost everything that we do on the web at the moment is an example of a social machine. The web itself, Google, Facebook, Twitter, Wikipedia, new ones like TripAdvisor, the Zooniverse work at Oxford, Ushahidi, and the way that's used in disaster management, the Amazons, the eBays, the YouTubes, right? They're all examples of social machines because they only work because we society, put material into the machine. So it's like you've got a network of computers, real Turing machines, and you've got a network of us as human beings with these sorts of machines, and together we create new types of artifacts like Wikipedia, like Google, like Twitter, like Facebook, like TripAdvisor, but these don't know anything about us and we don't know anything about them. But together we're creating these new artifacts, and that to me is an amazing thought, that we're creating things that couldn't have existed before this technology that Tim invented, before these ideas that we've developed, and if we weren't part of it. So if this became an alien world, a world in which you were scared, I mean, just think of the stories you hear of in the Middle East, where sometimes in the what do we call it, the spring, when everyone was going to get democratic in the Middle East. What was it called? Arab Spring. And they were some of the governments were using the social networks, encouraging people to go on the social networks, and then using that to imprison them. So if you thought that actually in China, the rule now that you cannot, the law that you cannot retweet, they have, it's Weibo and Baidu, they have the same same sort of services, but they're called different names, and of course there's a lot of censorship, and it's illegal to, in our terminology, to retweet something that is false, whether you knew it or not. Now, if you thought that you were going to be imprisoned for retweeting something that was false, whether you knew it or not, you would stop retweeting. Right? It changes people's behaviour dramatically. Now, the Chinese population find a way around it, and in fact, what I'm told lately is that they love microblogging, but they microblog pictures and cartoons, which are much harder, of course, for people to detect than 140 characters of text. They already got away. They had their characters are their symbols, so they get away with much more in a microblog than we do. But anyway, that's another whole story. How did I get into that world? It's the social machine. It's the social machine. That's what it's about. And we create it. But if we thought that these were dark places we didn't want to go, we wouldn't go there, and so they would die. There's all sorts of ways in which these things grow and die, and that's really what our social machines work is about. This is a big program of research we have, Southampton, Oxford and Edinburgh working together on a program grant from the EPSRC, where you're talking about, you've got the big data, you've got more machines, more compute power, you can analyse more data, add people into the equation, and what they're doing, you get the social networking, and then together we argue the social machines. This is a slide from my colleague Dave DeRoy. I really should put his name on this. So now I understand that if web science is the theory and practice of social machines, then as a computer scientist, what I've been doing for the last 20 years is the theory and practice of Turing machines. And I also give some talks about, do social machines have consciences? These things we're creating, can they have a conscience? Can they become thinking machines over time? And anyway, but more importantly for today, the question to us was, how do we study this? How do we capture what people do and how social machines grow and evolve and die or get reborn in other guise? And what are the similarities and differences around the world? And how can we use this to help us forecast the future so that we can keep the web going for the good of humanity and not let it become part of the dark side? So we, as part of this, we started this project that we, for good or bad, called the Web Observatory. And I think this is where I'm going to get into the day sets. Yes, I'm all right. So really drawing the analogy from how the astronomers, who are very clever at getting money, manage the information about, how our universe, where it came from, where it's going, by taking those amazing pictures from their telescopes. And you have observatories all over the world gathering this data, because it ends up as data, of course, despite the fact we look at the pictures of pieces as like pieces of art. It's data, and then there's a way, they've developed a way of sharing that data and sharing the tools by which they analyse that data, so that we can to know more and more about this universe that we're part of. And climate science is very like this as well. Forgive the slide, you can't read it all. But it amazes me that how in my lifetime, how the weather forecasts have got so much better. Well, partly that's part because there's a huge amount of data that's been collected over centuries, and the computers have got faster and the models have got better to analyse that data. But without the data that they've had for centuries and are still collecting, there would be no forecasts. And it was sort of like, well, we need to do this for the digital world. So we're doing it for the physical world and the natural world. We need to do it for to understand. There's a report comes out every day about how much ice there is and why there's more or less ice than there was. There's a wonderful report out today, I think it was from Southampton, that's why I read the press release, about how the ice age before last had a different ending to the last ice age. And of course, we're at the end of an ice age now. So anyway, it was just an amazing read that, there's still so much to understand about this stuff before you think about the CO2 emissions and the sustainability of the planet. So we survive another 100 years, let alone another millennium. And how is that going? Yes, so we need they were thinking, well, actually, we need to start collecting this data for the digital planet. And if you're going to do that, you've got this big data on steroids effect. But there's people around the world analysing what happens on Twitter and Facebook, analysing all the databases that they can in companies, open data, research data about what we do on the web. And it's not stored and it's not shared. When the project finishes, often dissipates. Now, in the UK, we now have to sign up to a data management policy before we can get research funding. We're all struggling with that a bit, but that's the same principle. It's this idea that you do, when you collect some data about, and in this case it's about how we're behaving on the web, what we're doing on the web, you don't throw it away, you put it in a repository and you share it with other people. At least you tell them it's there using metadata, even if they can't actually access it without going through you or without being in some safe harbour because it's secure or confidential data. So this was the thinking behind building the Web Observatory and creating partnerships around the world with like-minded scientists who wanted to share their data about what's happening today on the digital planet. And help collecting that so we have a history of what's happened that we can look back at in order to think about the future, to determine policy, to help determine policy, have some evidence base for helping governments decide what to do, and business intelligence for businesses, given that a lot of the data, of course, is in silos in different companies. The fact that Google's got a lot of data, it doesn't have the Facebook data. So, yes, anyway, right. So, to enable longitudinal research, which computer scientists are really bad at, and of course medics are really good at. And you've also worked out how you do the ethical stuff as well. We need to learn some of that. So this is us with our digital telescopes, and I sort of have this vision of a map of the world with lots of red flags that say, we're an observatory, right? And we've got data that we can share under certain terms and conditions, and this is what it's about, and here's the tools we use to analyse it, and you can use these. You may have to buy it from somebody, or this is open source, and all that information is in the catalogue of your observatory, and then we catalogue the catalogues. So, as I said, you can have levels of sharing, and the idea is to have observatories all around the world and have people. You were talking on the panel about qualitative data. I mean, we need lots of qualitative data as well. We can do the quantitative stuff if we've got the data, but then we need people to interpret that. And that's a really key thing about the work I'm doing and involved in, is the interpretation and then putting that back in the observatory. So a small ambition to map the digital universe. We have an observatory at Southampton. If you want to, so it has a data store, it has analytical tools, and there's a portal to enable people to look at what's in there. You can look at it if you go to webobservatory.sutton.ac.uk. I haven't got time, and I didn't seek to get on the internet here, but you can look at what data sets and what visualizations are in there. We have data sets, but this is a data set we got with I take my students around the world to the different labs, and this was a data set we got when we went to China about the salt crisis they had after the Fukushima accident in Japan. There's a salt crisis in China because of the mythology about salt protecting you from the fallout from nuclear reactions. And this was the students analysed the tweets and the stuff from Weibo about this from a point of view of humour, dark humour. And I can't go into the details, but there were some interesting ideas, and spotting when the crisis was over, but people were telling jokes about things in a different way. We look at when you can predict something happening by looking at, actually Wikipedia tends to predict flu outbreaks better than Google, but analysis of different types of what's happening, conversations on different types of networks. But the key thing is, if we do this work, we keep the data sets and so that we can use them for other work in the future. And the idea is we link up all our web observatories and we catalogue them using a schema. So if you've got an observatory, you just say, hi, I've got this data set, describe it using a very simple schema, nothing AI about it, and we catalogue it on the Trust website. This is an embryonic idea is beginning to get legs, and the Web Science Trust is coordinating this effort. So we're building a social machine to observe social machines, and I just want to show you an example. Here we are. This is the first time I've put these slides in. This was, my team have just come back from the University of Southern Australia. This is in Adelaide, and this work's being done with the South Australia government. And we've got in here population data. So we've got, if you can read it, you've got tweets, we've got historic tweets, we've got health data in there. And the thing here, and this is really why I think I'm here talking to you today, is think about what you can do if you can link data sets from all these different types of sources. So this one is about helping the South Australia government to help people. So how do you interact? How does a government interact with its citizens through the web? How does it try to seek to change behaviour? How do people report back and get that feedback loop going? And doing it so by analysing social networks and the health data sets that they've got and doing that cross-linking. So this is looking at health and well-being indicators. They've got data from 2011 and 2013, so we can get the social networks from that time and do the cross-pollination between the discussions that are going on and stuff in the health databases. You could do queries using the sort of terms you might look for, the risk factors and so on, and get the linked data. I haven't got time to go into the detail, I haven't got it live, but the point, I just want to make the point that once you start building one of these up, you can actually just think about, and this is what we're doing at Southampton. Let me just, as I explain this, let's put the slide up. What we're thinking about at Southampton is this idea that we've got, with our Institute for Life Sciences, we've got lots of information, data about the small systems, cell signaling and so on. We've got information about, we've got health records, and we've got information from large systems such as the social networking and our sites that we have from the marine and maritime and environmental sites. Now, so start thinking about how if you put all that together, you'd have information that would help you think about when someone presents in a GP surgery with symptoms. You're not just looking at them from, well, they've got this, we'll do this particular medical test because they've got this particular symptom. You're looking at them from a completely holistic review. Where did they grow up? You know, what was the environment they grew up in? And then you can, once you take that holistic view, and then you can start looking at pointing them to looking at the analysis of social networking sites. There's, for example, a really good work, as I'm sure you know, on diabetes, helping people control their diabetes, manage their diabetes through social networking, and getting those conversations going, and then analysing why do people not follow what's on there? You know, why do they drop out? How do we help them not drop out and actually take notice of the information that's there? So all this sort of, again, virtual circles, we hope. But this is new. This is very new. We've got our first cross-institute datathon in July, where we're sort of telling to people at Southampton, bring your data sets, so the medics, the biomedics, the marine, maritime, our social networking stuff, stuff about population and health records, and bringing those together and looking at actually we're going to take disaster management, because that's quite a hot topic at the moment. Sounds awful, but it is, because people are beginning to get grips on it, and we're looking at data sets from Nepal. And we're having a day when we get people into a room and look at what they can do if they can cross-reference this data. Now, we're just thinking about that from getting this going. There are huge issues there about linking someone's health records to anything else about them and keeping that private or letting it be shared. For example, in the diabetes, information about what helps people to understand how to manage something like diabetes. So there are huge issues here. Oh gosh, I left in the phrase within the Leave a Human bid. Sorry to do that. I meant to take that out. This was a slide that my colleague in the IFS put together for an internal bid to get to Leave a Human money. But this is the challenge for the Nexus project. So we're looking at systems from the biomedical world, from society and the environmental world, to pull them together to help us understand people in this human nexus. So I just want to finish with one thought, and then there might be 5 minutes for questions, or I'm stopping you getting a drink, one or the other. So where is this all going in terms of the web? Well, as I said at the beginning, we're in a world here that we have no knowledge of, and we don't know how to manage it. We don't understand it. We don't know who governs it. We have all the issues of cybersecurity and net neutrality and privacy and trust, and I'm on an Internet Governance Commission, and there's lots of very famous people trying to sort this out. We've had the fallout from the Snowden affair, and governments and society realizing just what is possible. I mean, potentially, my colleague Manuel Castells, a famous network scientist, social scientist, says we're walking into this 1984 world because the technology potentially allows us to, every piece of data that we create through the interaction with this system allows our governments to store and have the right to access. Is that what we want? Tim talks for, and other people talk about human rights charters for the internet. And it's interesting that this is happening while our government here is thinking about taking down the Human Rights Act and knee-jerking us into collecting more data about us. And you think, anyway. But and my argument is we need to collect all this data and do this integration in order to provide help policymakers make better decisions and provide intelligence for businesses as well. But I will just finish with one thought. Coming back to this social machine slide, lots and lots of people, and in the context of big data, are talking about this the Internet of Things as being, suddenly we're all going to have little machines, all these devices are going to all talk to each other and they're going to make our life easier. Do you remember the paperless office and how we're all going to have more leisure time and all that sort of stuff? Well, the thing about the Internet of Things is it's going to plonk itself here, and we don't really know how it's going to interoperate with us as social beings in this world we've created. The one thing I do know about the Internet of Things is it isn't yet an internet. And this is what I said right the way back. Why isn't it an internet? Because at the moment, it hasn't had its Vint Cerf or its Tim Berners-Lee moment. The protocols that enable the things to talk to each other are very proprietary and owned by companies. They're all in little silos. You have to be in the Samsung world or the Apple world or the Google world or whatever. And that is our saving grace as well as a disadvantage. It means we can't achieve the full potential yet, but actually, at the moment, it might buy us a bit of time to be able to sort out the governance of all this before the machines start really taking over the world and making decisions about us without us being in the loop. If I had more time, I'd talk that through. But anyway, that's where I'd like. This is another big data question. And for sure, we need to gather data about the small experiments that are beginning to happen in this world that impinge hugely on the medical world so that we can maybe understand it before it really gets us. I'll finish there. Thank you.
I guess you've already spoken about it a bit, but the the balance of openness and accessibility of data, how does that balance with this need of privacy, especially in the health domain?
This is, I mean, I've talked about it a bit, but I think that we have to work out methodologies for doing this, and we don't have them yet. I believe we technologists can earn a lot for the medical world in terms of how you do the experiments. So, because you need to do the experiments, but you need to really protect people's privacy, and so we have to convince people to trust the technology. I think that's feasible. I mean, most of us get in aeroplanes and things. You know, I think we can do it, but you know, there's a lot of mistrust out there because everyone hears about cybersecurity stuff every day and things being broken into, but you know, they have all the answers at GCHQ. Actually, we just need them to share them with us a bit. They know how to build secure systems there. No, I joke a bit, but it is all about trust at one level.
Great. Well, on that note, well, thank you very much for your fantastic talk.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me.